66 million years ago, when the asteroid hit and the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared, South America was still connected to the rest of the world. Land bridges ran north toward North America and south toward Antarctica. Animals moved. Life was, by the standards of the time, relatively unremarkable. And then, over the next few million years, those connections broke. Sea levels shifted, the land bridges went under, and South America drifted away from everything else on the planet and stayed there, completely surrounded by ocean, for the next 30 million years. Nothing got in, nothing got out, and evolution handed an entire continent and zero competition, did what evolution always does when nobody is watching. It went completely insane. The herbivores alone should have been a warning. South America's isolation produced two entirely unique groups of large plant eaters, the notungulates and the leptopterns, that had no close relatives anywhere else on Earth. Not distantly related to rhinos, not related to horses, not related to hippos. Their own thing entirely, assembled from scratch over 30 million years with no outside interference and no reason to look like anything that had come before. When Charles Darwin dug up their fossils in Patagonia in 1834, he could not figure out what he was looking at. One skull was so confusing he initially identified it as a mastodon. It wasn't even in the same order. It was Toxodon, built like a rhinoceros that had also decided to become a hippo simultaneously for reasons that made sense only on this continent. Adults reached 3.5 meters or 11 feet in length and weighed up to 1,000 kilograms, roughly the mass of a small car. Short, dense legs, a barrel body for processing enormous volumes of vegetation, high-crowned teeth for grinding whatever the landscape offered. Darwin described its skull as one of the most extraordinary he had ever seen. Features from completely unrelated modern animals that had no business appearing on the same face, which would be embarrassing for any species, except Toxodon had no idea other continents existed and had nothing to be embarrassed about. And then there was the animal you saw at the start of this video, Macrauchenia, a leptoptern. 1.8 meters at the shoulder, around 1,000 kilograms, camel neck, rhinoceros legs, three-toed feet. And that trunk, a nasal passage positioned so high on its skull that paleontologists are now fairly confident it operated like one. A trunk on an animal completely unrelated to elephants or tapirs that simply arrived at the same solution independently because the canopy was there, and evolution does not check its work against other continents before committing. Which, if you think about it, is genuinely insane. Two separate lineages, opposite sides of the planet, both growing trunks because it turned out to be useful. South America just got there entirely alone, without any help, without anyone noticing for 30 million years, of course. And it gets worse. Because while the herbivores were busy inventing themselves from scratch, the predators were doing something considerably more alarming. South America's isolation meant the standard large placental carnivores, the cats, the dogs, the bears, never arrived. The continent needed apex predators and had to build them from whatever raw material was available. And what was available, it turned out, was birds. And marsupials. Which sounds like the setup to a joke. It was not a joke. The terror birds, Forus ricidae, dominated South America as apex predators for over 50 million years. 50 million years. Longer than any other predator lineage has held a continent in the history of life on Earth. The largest species stood 3 meters tall, roughly 10 feet, and weighed up to 150 kilograms. Flightless. They compensated by being fast. Studies estimate at least 48 kilometers per hour, faster than any human being will run without pharmaceutical assistance. Their skulls were deep, laterally compressed, hooked at the tip like an axe. Biomechanical analysis suggests they hunted by driving that skull downward at full speed, stunning or killing outright, then tearing pieces free with the hook. No grasping forelimbs, no claws, just a skull the size of a horse's head being swung into prey at running speed. Kelenken guillemoy, one of the largest species from Patagonia, had a skull 71 centimeters long. 71 centimeters, longer than most people's arms from shoulder to wrist. If you somehow found yourself on those South American plains 15 million years ago, one of these was running toward you, it would have been taller than you, faster than you, and it would not have needed to do anything complicated. It would have swung its head. That would have been sufficient. You would not have seen it as a bird. You would have seen it as a problem with no solution. Except that's not even the alarming part. Running alongside the terror birds, filling the forested and scrubland niches where open country birds struggled, were the Sparacidons, a group of carnivorous marsupial relatives, not true marsupials, not placental mammals, something in between, that had evolved in complete isolation and produced, among other things, Thylacosmilus atrox. The name means pouch saber. It was jaguar-sized, around 120 kilograms, and it had upper canine teeth so large they extended upward through the roof of its skull and curved down past its chin. Not slightly enlarged canines. Canines that ran the entire length of its face, housed in a purpose-built bony flange on the lower jaw that existed solely to protect them when the mouth was closed. Smilodon, the famous North American saber-tooth, had impressive canines. Thylacosmilus had bigger ones. On an animal that had never encountered a cat, on a continent that had never produced a cat, which arrived at the exact same body plan independently, because isolation does not mean simplicity. It means whatever evolution feels like doing that week, with no supervision whatsoever. Well, here's where it gets genuinely strange. Recent biomechanical studies found that Thylacosmilus had a bite force roughly comparable to a house cat, which led some researchers to propose it was not a conventional predator at all, but a highly specialized scavenger, using those extraordinary canines to open carcasses rather than kill. Which does not make it less alarming. It makes it more alarming. An animal with the most extreme dental weaponry of any known mammal, possibly just tearing into things that were already dead, and doing very well at it for millions of years. Talk about finding your niche. And then, the rodent. This part requires a moment, because among everything South America's isolation produced, the trunk-faced ungulates, the axe-beaked birds, the marsupial with a face full of sabers, it also produced the largest rodent ever to exist on this planet. Josephoartigasia manesi, related to the guinea pig. It weighed around 1,000 kilograms at conservative estimates. 1 full metric ton, the size of a buffalo. It stood 1.5 meters tall and measured nearly 3 meters nose to tail. Incisor teeth 30 centimeters long, the length of a school ruler, wielded the way an elephant uses its tusks. Digging, defense, combat with rivals. Its skull alone was 53 centimeters long. Biomechanical modeling places its molar bite force at up to 4,165 newtons, enough technically to snap a human femur. It was a rodent. The largest rodent that will almost certainly ever exist, because the conditions that produced it are gone and not coming back. Yeah. And it lived on the same continent at roughly the same time as the terror birds and Thylacosmilus, which means that somewhere in Pliocene South America, a buffalo-sized guinea pig with ruler-length teeth was sharing grassland with a 3-meter axe-beaked bird and a marsupial whose canines ran the entire length of its own face. And somehow that was just a Tuesday. That was just the landscape. That was normal. It ended. Of course it ended. About 3 million years ago, volcanic activity in Central America produced the Isthmus of Panama, a continuous land bridge between North and South America for the first time in tens of millions of years. What followed is called the Great American Biotic Interchange. North American animals poured south: horses, mastodons, deer, tapirs. And with them, the placental carnivores South America had never encountered in its entire history. The big cats, the dogs, the bears, animals that had spent millions of years being sharpened by competition that South America's fauna knew absolutely nothing about. The results were not close. The notungulates went extinct. The latopterns went extinct. Thylacosmilus disappeared almost immediately. Macrauchenia held on until roughly 10,000 years ago, possibly helped toward extinction by humans whose sustained hunting pressure the megafauna of an isolated continent was completely unprepared for, having never needed to fear anything that walked on 2 legs. The terror birds tried. One species, Titanus walleri, crossed north into Florida and Texas, the only known case of a large South American predator invading North America during the interchange. It didn't last. Nothing from that world lasted once the door opened. What remains is the fossil record, and the question that sits inside it: if the Isthmus of Panama had never formed, if the isolation had held for another 30 million years, what would South America have eventually produced? It had already built a buffalo-sized rodent, a marsupial with the most extreme canines of any known mammal, and a bird that ran an entire continent for 50 million years without a single outside challenge. It was, by any reasonable measure, building towards something. We just never got to find out what. That, somehow, is the most unsettling part of all. Thanks for watching.